Hello there, I'm Carlos, and this is Kingdoms, where all your nerdy dreams come true. We have an awesome narrated game of cEDH for you today. We played online with our patrons as part of their perks, so if you'd like to play with me and show your deck online, come and join the Kingdom. So for today, we have Matthias playing Najeela the Blade Blossom, Carlos playing Kess Dissident Mage, Johnny playing Blim Comedic Genius, and Morton playing Jetmir Nexus of Revels. Let's play. Matthias gets to go first, but Morton has a pregame action, exiling Linvala, Keeper of Silence, to Gemstone Caverns. Matthias draws, plays Forbidden Orchard, he then plays Mana Crypt and taps Forbidden Orchard for 1 blue mana, giving Johnny a 1/1 spirit creature token. He taps Mana Crypt for 2 colorless and casts Rhystic Study. He passes the turn. You know you're in a cEDH game when first turn Rhystic Study comes out. Carlos draws, regrets his life choices, plays a tapped Watery Grave, and passes the turn. Johnny draws and plays a Swamp, taps for black and plays Imperial Seal. Not playing for Rhystic Study, Matthias draws a card. Johnny searches his library for a card, puts it on top, loses 2 life. He then attacks Carlos for 1 with a Spirit token. Carlos takes 1 damage and Johnny passes the turn. Morton draws, plays a Plains for turn, taps for 2, and plays Dranith Magistrate without paying for Rhystic Study. Matthias draws and Morton passes. Matthias untaps and rolls for Mana Crypt, taking no damage. He draws and plays Exotic Orchard for turn. He taps Exotic Orchard for red and plays Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He then taps Mana Crypt for 2 colorless and uses 1 of them to cast Mana Vault. He then lets the floating mana go and passes the turn. Carlos untaps and draws, playing Command Tower, then taps both lands to play Dockside Extortionist without paying for Rhystic Study. Matthias draws and Carlos gets 3 treasures and passes the turn. Johnny untaps, draws, and plays Grafdigger's Cage for 1, not paying for Rhystic Study. Matthias draws and Johnny passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws and taps 1 white to cast Mother of Runes, paying 1 for Rhystic Study. He then plays a Gaia's Cradle as land for turn, taps for 2 green, and casts Wild Growth on his plains, using the other green to pay for Rhystic Study. He then passes the turn with 2 cards in hand. Matthias untaps, fails his Mana Crypt roll, and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays Steam Vents untapped, paying 2 life. He then passes the turn. Carlos untaps and draws, plays Urza's Saga as land for turn, putting 1 lore counter on it. He passes the turn. Johnny untaps and draws, casts Jeweled Lotus for 0, using his Swamp to pay for Rhystic Study. At the end step, Matthias taps to cast Fire Covenant, paying 8 life to target each creature to deal lethal damage, including the Spirit token from Forbidden Orchard. In response, Carlos casts Deflecting Swat to change the target of the Fire Covenant from his Dockside Extortionist to Matthias's Ragavan. The rest of the targets stay the same. He does not pay for Rhystic Study. Matthias draws, the spell resolves, the creatures are destroyed, and the turn moves to Morton. Morton untaps and draws, pays 2 mana to cast Hushbringer, with an additional 1 mana to pay for Rhystic Study, and passes the turn. Matthias untaps, rolls for Mana Crypt, doesn't take any damage. He plays City of Brass for turn, taps Exotic Orchard and Mana Crypt to cast Najeela the Blade Blossom, and passes the turn. Carlos untaps and draws and adds a lore counter to Urza's Saga. He plays Verdant Catacombs as a land for turn and cracks it to find Underground Sea, puts it into play, and passes the turn. Johnny untaps and draws, pays 2 life to play Blood Crypt untapped, and sacrifices Jeweled Lotus for 3 black mana. He taps his other 2 lands to get 5 mana, and uses 4 of it to cast Blim Comedic Genius, using the additional mana to pay for Rhystic Study. He passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws, and taps all of his land to play Jetmir Nexus of Revels. He cannot pay for Rhystic Study, so Matthias draws a card. Morton passes the turn. Matthias untaps and rolls for Mana Crypt, taking 3 damage. He draws and plays Sacred Foundry tapped. He then taps Exotic Orchard for blue and casts Mystic Remora. Johnny responds by casting Deadly Rollick, targeting Najeela and not paying for Rhystic Study. Matthias draws from the trigger. Matthias then taps Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, and Steam Vents to recast Najeela and passes the turn. At the end of turn, Carlos uses the ability on Urza's Saga to create a 0/0 construct that gets +1/+1 for each artifact he controls. Carlos then untaps, draws, and with Urza's Saga's 3rd ability on the stack, pays 2 mana to create another 0/0 construct. The 3rd ability resolves. Carlos searches for an artifact card and finds Soul Ring. He plays an Ancient Tomb as land for turn and attacks Matthias with his 6/6 construct, then passes the turn. Johnny untaps and draws and moves right into combat. He attacks Matthias with Blim for 4 commander damage. Matthias takes 4, and Blim's ability triggers, giving Matthias control of Grafdigger's Cage. Matthias then loses 1 life and discards a Tinderwall to Blim's ability. Second main phase, Johnny plays Dauthi Voidwalker, not paying for Rhystic Study. In response to the Rhystic Study trigger, Carlos casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, returning each non-land permanent he does not control to their owner's hand. Carlos does not pay for Remora or Rhystic Study, and Matthias draws 2 cards. The Cyclonic Rift resolves, goes to the graveyard, then Dauthi Voidwalker resolves, and Johnny passes the turn with 6 cards in hand. Morton untaps and draws, taps for 2, and casts Hushbringer. After it resolves, he taps Gaia's Cradle for 1 and casts Wild Growth on his plains and passes the turn. Matthias untaps and draws, casts Mana Crypt for 0. Then using 1 colorless mana, casts Mana Vault. He then taps Mana Vault and Steam Vents to cast Rhystic Study with 2 colorless mana remaining. He then pays 2 life to play Blood Crypt untap and taps Exotic Orchard to cast Esper Sentinel. He then pays 3 mana to cast Najeela the Blade Blossom and passes the turn. Carlos untaps and draws, plays Shivan Reef for turn, and casts Rhystic Study. He pays 2 mana to pay for the Esper Sentinel and Rhystic Study triggers and takes 2 damage. Carlos then moves to combat and attacks Matthias for 9 damage. Matthias blocks Dockside Extortionist with Najeela and taps City of Brass for a blue mana, losing 1 life. He then exiles Mystic Remora as an additional cost to play March of Swirling Mist, targeting Carlos's constructs. In response, Carlos casts a spell, targeting March of Swirling Mist, tapping Shivan Reef to pay for Rhystic Study. Matthias responds by casting Force of Will, exiling Dovin's Veto and paying 1 life, targeting Dispel. He does not pay for Carlos's Rhystic Study, and Carlos draws a card. Force of Will resolves, countering Dispel, and March of Swirling Mist resolves, causing Carlos's constructs to phase out. Dockside is killed to combat damage and is exiled to Dauthi Voidwalker. March of Swirling Mist, Dispel, and Force of Will are as well. Carlos passes the turn to Johnny. Johnny untaps and draws, plays Mana Confluence for turn, pays 1 life to tap it to cast Grafdigger's Cage. He does not pay for Esper Sentinel or Rhystic Study, and Matthias draws 2 cards, Carlos draws 1 card. He then taps the rest of his mana and casts Phyrexian Revoker, not paying for Rhystic Study. Both Matthias and Carlos draw, and Johnny names Najeela for the Revoker. Najeela's activated abilities cannot be activated. Johnny passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws, and plays Finned Horned Elves without paying for Rhystic Study. Matthias and Carlos draw. Morton then uses the remaining mana to cast Jetmir Nexus of Revels, and does not pay for Rhystic Study. Carlos and Matthias draw. Morton attacks Matthias for 2 flying damage. Matthias takes 2, and Morton gains 2 life from Hushbringer's lifelink ability, and passes the turn with 4 cards in hand. Matthias untaps and takes 1 damage from his tapped Mana Vault. Rolls for Crypt and takes no damage. He then draws and taps Sacred Foundry for white to cast Silence. He pays 1 mana for Mana Crypt to pay for Carlos's Rhystic Study. In response, Carlos casts Tainted Pact using his treasure tokens and does not pay for Rhystic Study or Esper Sentinel. Matthias draws 2 cards and Tainted Pact resolves. Carlos exiles a bunch of cards. Some of the notable ones are Ad Nauseam, Demonic Consultation, Lotus Petal, Brain Freeze, Reflecting Pool, Time Twister, Lion's Eye Diamond, Intuition, Praetor's Grasp, Force of Will, Thassa's Oracle, Necropotence, and a bunch more. Eventually, he reveals Mental Misstep. Carlos then pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep to counter Silence, and does not pay for Rhystic Study. Silence and Mental Misstep both get void counters. Matthias draws. Matthias then taps Mana Crypt and uses 1 of the mana to cast Soul Ring without paying for Rhystic Study. He then taps 2 to cast Soul Partition, targeting Phyrexian Revoker without paying for Rhystic Study. Carlos draws. In response, Johnny uses Dauthi Voidwalker's ability to cast Silence from exile without paying its mana cost, and does not pay for Esper Sentinel or Rhystic Study. Matthias draws 2 and Carlos draws 1. Silence resolves and Soul Partition resolves, exiling Phyrexian Revoker. Matthias plays Command Tower as his land for turn and attacks Carlos with Najeela for 3. Najeela's ability triggers and a 1/1 warrior is tapped and attacking, also going at Carlos. Prior to damage, Matthias pays Najeela's activated ability to untap all attacking creatures, and they get Trample, Lifelink, and Haste until end of turn, as well as an additional combat phase. Carlos takes 4 and Matthias gains 4. Matthias attacks Carlos again, this time for 6 damage. A second warrior is created, and Carlos takes 6 damage, and Matthias gains another 4 life. After combat, Matthias moves to his cleanup step and discards Imperial Seal, Marsh Flats, and Arcane Signet, and passes the turn. Carlos's constructs phase in, and he untaps and draws. He plays Exotic Orchard and casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Dark Confidant. He does not pay for Esper Sentinel or Rhystic Study, and Matthias draws 2 cards. He then attacks Matthias for 8 damage with his constructs, and then post-combat plays Toxic Deluge. He pays 2 life to give all creatures -2/-2, leaving only Jetmir and the constructs on the board. He also pays for Rhystic Study. He then taps for 4 mana using Ancient Tomb, losing 2 life. With the 4 mana, Carlos plays Displacer Kitten and does not pay for Rhystic Study, and Matthias draws. Unfortunately, Carlos makes a mistake and plays a second land for turn, forgetting that he already had played Forgotten Orchard earlier in the turn. He plays Arid Mesa and passes the turn. Fortunately, this doesn't give Carlos any advantage because Johnny untaps and draws for turn, plays Dockside Extortionist without paying for Rhystic Study. Carlos and Matthias draw a card. Carlos goes to crack the Arid Mesa and actually fails to find any land in his deck because it's so small at this point. Carlos responds by casting Delay on Dockside without paying for Rhystic Study, and Matthias draws. Displacer Kitten triggers from the delay. Carlos exiles a Soul Ring, returns to the battlefield untapped. Delay resolves and a Dockside Extortionist is exiled with 3 time counters on it, and Johnny passes the turn. Morton untaps for turn, draws, and pays 4 mana to cast Shalai, Voice of Plenty. Without paying for Rhystic Study, Matthias and Carlos draw a card. Morton then moves to combat, attacks Matthias for 5 damage, killing Matthias, and Morton then passes the turn. Carlos untaps and draws, and attacks Morton for 8 damage with his constructs and 2 damage to Johnny with Displacer Kitten. During second main phase, Carlos taps Soul Ring for 2 colorless mana, and then casts Mystical Tutor. Displacer Kitten triggers and Soul Ring is exiled and returned to the battlefield. Carlos tutors for Force of Navigation, puts it on top of his library. He then taps for red, black, and blue, and 1 remaining colorless mana floating, casts Kess, Dissonant Mage. He then plays Steam Vents, tap for turn, and passes. Johnny untaps, and on his upkeep removes 1 time counter from Dockside Extortionist, and then draws. He plays Plaza of Heroes as his land for turn and casts Blim, Comedic Genius without paying for Rhystic Study, and passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws and plays Bountiful Promenade for turn, and then taps 6 mana to cast Aberbrook Caretaker. Carlos taps for 2 blue, taking 1 damage from Shivan Reef, and casts Mana Drain to counter Aberbrook Caretaker, and misses the Displacer Kitten trigger. Morton passes the turn. Carlos untaps and draws and gets 6 colorless mana in his main phase from Mana Drain. He then plays Underground River as his land for turn and moves to combat. He attacks Johnny for 11 damage, which he takes. Carlos then casts Dothi Voidwalker in second main phase and passes the turn. Johnny untaps, removes a time counter from Dockside Extortionist, and draws. He then moves to combat and attacks Carlos with Blim and gives him control of Grafdigger's Cage. Carlos then takes 1 damage and misses the discard trigger. Johnny then casts a Braid targeting one of Carlos's artifact construct tokens. Carlos casts Force of Negation targeting a Braid, and Displacer Kitten triggers targeting Kess. With a trigger on the stack, Johnny casts Deflecting Swat, changing the target of the Force of Negation to Deflecting Swat. Deflecting Swat is countered, Kess is blinked, and a Braid resolves, destroying Carlos's construct token. Johnny passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws, pays 1 red and 1 green to channel Sozinken, Crucible of Defiance, to create 2 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens with haste. He then moves to combat and attacks Carlos with Jetmir and Shalai for 10 damage. Carlos blocks Jetmir with Displacer Kitten and takes 5 damage. Carlos untaps and draws and plays Training Center for turn and passes. Johnny untaps and removes the final time counter from Dockside Extortionist and casts it without paying its mana cost. And it has haste. He doesn't pay for Rhystic Study, and Carlos draws a card. When it enters, he gets 6 treasure tokens and then draws a card for turn. He then casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing the Dockside Extortionist to tutor for a card, and does not pay for Rhystic Study, and Carlos draws. He then taps for 2, paying 1 life from Mana Confluence and using 1 treasure to cast Wheel of Fortune without paying for Rhystic Study. Carlos responds and casts Negate, countering the Wheel of Fortune. Johnny then uses 4 treasures to cast Phyrexian Revoker. Morton responds by using Shalai's ability and gives each of his creatures a +1/+1 counter. Revoker resolves and Johnny names Shalai Voice of Plenty, and Johnny passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws and plays Avacyn's Pilgrim without paying for Rhystic Study. Carlos draws. Morton then taps for 3 more to cast Yisan Wanderer Bard without paying for Rhystic Study. Carlos draws. Morton then taps for 1 white mana to cast Deafening Silence without paying for Rhystic Study, and Carlos draws. Carlos then casts Pact of Negation on Deafening Silence, and it is countered. Morton then moves to combat and attacks Carlos with Shalai for 6 damage. Carlos does not block and takes 6. At the end of turn, Carlos casts Saw in Half, targeting his Dothi Voidwalker. This creates 2/2/1 copies of Dothi Voidwalker under Carlos's control. Carlos untaps On upkeep pays 5 mana for the Pact of Negation to avoid losing the game. He also takes 2 damage from the Ancient Tomb. He then draws and sacrifices one of his Dothi Voidwalkers to cast a Braid targeting the Grafdigger's Cage. Grafdigger's Cage is destroyed, and using Kess's ability, Carlos casts Cyclonic Rift from his graveyard for the overload cost, returning each downland permanent he does not control to their owner's hands. He then moves to combat and attacks Johnny with his Construct and Kess for a total of 6 damage. Second main phase, Carlos casts Reanimate, targeting Avabruck Caretaker. It resolves and he puts it on a battlefield under his control, losing 6 life and passes the turn. Johnny untaps and draws and casts Phyrexian Revoker, naming Dothi Voidwalker, and then taps for 2 to cast Shred Memory, targeting Displacer Kitten, Saw in Half, Mystical Tutor, and Mana Drain. These cards are exiled and Shred Memory is exiled to Dothi Voidwalker. Johnny passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws, taps to play Soul Ring, and Carlos no longer wants to draw from the Mystic Study. Morton then casts Avacyn's Pilgrim and Shalai, Voice of Plenty, and passes the turn. Carlos untaps and draws and plays City of Brass for turn. He then pays the dash cost for the Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He then moves to combat, triggers the Avabruck Caretaker by putting 2+1/+1 counters on Kess, and attacks Johnny with his Construct, the Avabruck Caretaker, and Ragavan. Johnny blocks the Avabruck Caretaker and takes 5 damage. The Ragavan triggers, and Carlos creates a treasure token, and Johnny reveals the top of his library. Johnny reveals a Relic of Progenitus, and Carlos casts it for 1 mana. Carlos passes the turn. Johnny untaps and draws and plays Sphere of Resistance, and while holding priority casts Tybalt's Trickery, targeting Sphere of Resistance. Tybalt's Trickery resolves and the sphere is countered. Johnny gets a 2 at random, mills 2 cards, and then exiles a Soul Guide Lantern, which he then chooses to cast without paying its mana cost. The 2 milled cards, the Sphere of Resistance, and Tybalt's Trickery all get void counters. Johnny then taps the Lantern and sacrifices it to exile his opponent's graveyards, and the Lantern goes to Dothi Voidwalker. He then passes the turn. Morton untaps and draws and plays Ranger Captain of Eos, searching for Serra Ascendant. He then casts Serra Ascendant, then Yisan the Wanderer Bard. Morton is still at high enough life for the Serra Ascendant to be active. Carlos knows he can't win with Serra Ascendant having lifelink, and both he and Johnny concede the game to Morton, who has Jetmir Wildgrowth and Finale of Devastation in hand to ensure the win on his next turn. Good game. Well, what did you think? Were there any big turning points that changed the outcome? I'd love to hear more about it in the comments down below. Remember to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow and have more opportunities to bring you fun shows like these. A reminder that you can play with us directly through our private Discord or on an episode like this by checking out our new Patreon tiers at patreon.com/KingdomsTV. Speaking of which, a big shout out to our King patrons, Worthy Glover and Jordan Ritchie. You rule. Thanks to the Pillars of the Kingdom, Chris Crowley, LDAP, and Morton Christensen. And remember, keep it nerdy.